We heard of first encounters, some successful and some not so successful in terms of refugees and sponsors, and we're moved by the words of our second keynote speaker, Senator Van Hai Ngo. Today we will learn about how Canadian institutions, federal, provincial, and municipal, organize themselves to provide services to refugees and sponsors, and we'll hear about the experience of arriving, settling, and fitting into Canadian society from the perspectives of former refugees and their descendants. And in the afternoon, we'll move to the present and explore the current state of the sponsorship program and whether the experience of nearly 40 years ago has any relevance to Canada's contemporary refugee resettlement effort. And I should perhaps note that the Senator has committed to help us arrange a meeting with the new Minister of Citizenship and Immigration, Chris Alexander. So that was one of the positive developments that came out of the meeting yesterday. This morning's panel is being chaired by Naomi Alpin, and Naomi is a fellow and adjunct professor from Queen's University, where she has the chair of the Public Policy Forum in the School of Policy Studies. She's also a senior fellow at the Maitrey Foundation, where she leads its policy work on immigration issues, and she's the vice chair of the board of the Toronto Immigrant Employment Council. She has written extensively on Canadian immigration policy and advises the federal and provincial governments, universities, colleges, regulatory bodies, and NGOs on a variety of topics, including immigrant labor market and integration. Previously, Naomi worked at the senior levels in the Canadian, federal, and Ontario provincial governments for some 25 years, including 8 years as a deputy minister in 3 different portfolios. During the Indo-Chinese refugee resettlement period, Naomi was the Director of Settlement for the Ontario Region of Employment and Immigration Canada. Please welcome Naomi.
Thank you. Thanks very much, James. It's a pleasure to have been here for the past 3 days, I guess, the pre-conference and then 2 days of the conference and today. I came to the role as in the Ontario region settlement mission, knowing nothing about immigration except my family's personal story. But I was seconded from the Employment Development Branch into the Immigration Division to be the lead for this particular movement, and it was probably one of the most important and exciting times of my life and jobs that I ever had. It became not just a profession but an avocation that continues with lots of love. So I'm grateful to the movement and for the opportunity I had to be part of it. Because of my role in the Ontario region, that's sort of the focus that we're using as a case study. Things may have been done differently in other provinces and other regions, but given that Ontario received more than 22,000 refugees in that period of time from Southeast Asia, we perhaps did things a little bit differently. This session, as James has indicated, is really about the organizational response. And we're going to be talking in the panel both about the individual organization's response, represented by people here, but also the collective response of the various organizations that had to work together, because none of this would have been possible had there not been that real spirit of partnership and collaboration among the various organizations that were involved. We've heard over the past few days about the need for partnership and collaboration within CEIC, and how we had that both from abroad with these officers, certainly led by very strong leadership at national headquarters, And we spoke a little bit about the roles of the CICs and roles of the refugee liaison officers. We probably mentioned in passing some of the roles of the CECs, but we really haven't talked at all about the role of the provinces across the country, but we're going to be talking particularly about the province of Ontario. We haven't spoken about the role of municipalities, and they were pretty important players in this. We haven't really talked about the settlement service organizations and the role that they played, and the role that was also played by the new burgeoning refugee-specific settlement organizations that were created during that period. And we haven't talked about the role of the broader community agencies that were involved in the initiative at all. So that's what this morning's panel is really going to focus on. We're going to focus on some of the other partners who were directly involved in the exercise. The local CEC settlement councillors, Canada Employment Centre's settlement councillors, and they will be ably represented by Ralph up above. Hi, Ralph.
Hello, how are you?
Good. And Ralph is joining us from Windsor, where he lives now and where he lived then and was a CEC settlement councillor. Deb Ashford, who was also a CEC settlement councillor in the London area. They were basically, well, they'll tell you about what their role was, but just as an overview, they were responsible for the settlement of government-assisted refugees who were destined to those communities who did not have sponsors, although they did become involved with some sponsored refugees as well in some of their other roles. We have here to my right Yu Lee, who was he worked both at the Sudbury Multicultural Centre and then at OCISO, the Ottawa Carleton Immigrant Services Organization. In both centres, he was the executive director of an ISAP-funded agency, a federally funded immigrant and settlement agency. And we also have with us Betty Butterworth, who was, she doesn't like when I call her a senior civil servant, so but that's what she was, at the Ontario government, the Ontario Ministry of, I think it was called then Citizenship, Culture and Recreation.
Culture and Recreation, but in 1980 it was split and became culture.
Doesn't matter.
Citizenship and culture.
This ministry changed names and structures every Monday and Wednesday. It was hard to keep track. And at my far left, we have Rosanna Scotty, who was started off actually with the Secretary of State at the very beginning of the movement, and then became very actively involved in policy, diversity issues, equity issues, and legal settlement area for the Metro Toronto. I just want to mention very briefly, because Rosanna is going to speak more about this, but I think it's a really interesting model. We set up at that time something called the SPPC, the Settlement Planning and Programming Committee, which had representation of all levels of government, all departments within those levels of government that were directly related, involved with immigrant and refugee settlement, representatives from the United Way, and representatives from settlement agencies. And that group was incredibly effective in coordinating at fairly senior levels of the organization the planning and programming that was required to settle refugees in this movement in our region. And that vehicle that allowed us to sit at the same table, thinking about these issues, planning for these issues, and acting on the issues. We were all sort of senior enough. I co-chaired it with my counterpart in the province of Ontario. We were senior enough to actually make decisions at that table and then ensure that they were implemented. That model served us incredibly well, and we'll talk a little bit about why it may have worked or not. So the way we've decided to proceed is I have 4 questions for each of the individuals, and we will go in turn and then open it up for questions to the floor. The first question I would like to pose to the panel is for them to describe the context within which they were working and their organization was working, delivering services to refugees before the advent of this massive movement. So what was it like before the massive influx? So Ralph, do you want to start?
Certainly, certainly. I was an employment counselor with the CEC, housed in the same building as the unemployment insurance. So our basic function was assisting people in finding employment and in doing reports based on the employment aspect. The few refugees that I saw between 1975 and 78, the Kurds and the Ugandans, came as, in our circumstance, came as a group. The Kurds came as a group of 15, 16, I think there was, all from the same area, all the same villages. Their leader came with them, and they came on the same day. So I was able, I was able to do what I had to do in addition to handling the, I think if I remember correctly, I had the automotive file. 160, 180 clients involved there. So took a couple of days to take care of that group. The Ugandans were in the same situation. And that kind of, it was a part-time thing. Settlement was just a part-time issue. It was something I perceived, management felt it was something immigration should be doing, and we have to put this resource out there, take care of it, and then get on with business.
Thank you. Deborah.
Thank you. I also worked with the Canada Employment Centre. I started with the government in 1974, fresh out of university, and worked as an employment counsellor for about 6 months. And then an opportunity in the London Canada Employment Centre came open for a programs counsellor. I had a real interest because one of the about 8 roles in various programs that we administered was immigrant reception, which meant every new immigrant who came into and wanted services from the employment center first went through me, so I got to welcome them to Canada, verify that they were eligible for services, and give them a little bit of orientation and get them involved in the system. And there was also this wonderful word of refugee work, and it was about a year before I met my first refugees, and they were from Chile. And then I guess it was probably 76 and 77. I worked with settling about 70 Kurdish refugees over a year period. A little bit more involved, I guess, than what Ralph was, just because of the numbers, but it was very exciting. But the role of settlement was just, as Ralph said, a very tiny part of a very broad programs position. And certainly nothing that had any formality or any training to prepare you for it. You just got a telex, and I said, Kurds? What are Kurds? And then we went from there. So anyway, that was my beginning with the department.
You.
I had just, I was in the process of moving from Ottawa, from Ottawa back to my hometown, Sudbury. And while I was in Ottawa, Marion Dewar had, there was a big event at Lansdowne Park, and there was a couple of thousand people there. Bruce Coburn played, a young Bruce Coburn. And Marion Dewar made a commitment to bringing in 4,000 refugees to Ottawa and challenged the community, and the community rose up. Now, that's one story. A few months later, I moved to Sudbury. Sudbury was in deep economic depression. They had, I moved there as the executive director of a multicultural center that they had, and part of the services were to newcomers. There were thousands of people laid off. 25% of the workforce in Sudbury were directly, this is a real Canadian story, resource-based economy. 25% of the workforce was tied directly to Falconbridge Nickel and to Inco. And they were laying off 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 people. It was just, the impact was just devastating. And in fact, Mayor Lamro at the time said to me, he says, we don't even know how big the impact is, because all these small businesses are closing, a electrical companies are closing, restaurants are closing, and there was out-migration of just the residents to find work elsewhere. That was the setting.
And tell me about the role that Sudbury Multicultural played with immigrants arriving at the time.
When I arrived, there was a debate, and I think we spoke to John Bolinski, who was the immigration officer at that time, and he had a talk with the board at that time. At one of my first board meetings, he was talking about whether Sudbury was going to be able to handle any kind of, there were a few there already, but any kind of refugee flow because of the economic situation.
And the answer was?
The board wanted to move ahead. The board was made up of immigrants. They were people who were Hungarian refugees themselves. They were anxious to have.
Great, okay. Betty?
Well, I feel that I'm here I was looking at this last night, and I realized I'm really the only person, I think, that was involved in a provincial government in those days. And in actual fact, in those days, the provincial governments took a huge role in settlement. I know in Quebec they were involved in choosing immigrants as well, but settlement was a huge responsibility for the provinces. And I worked in the Ministry of eventually Citizenship and Culture, and Recreation, whatever. But we were the Newcomer Services branch. There was also the Multicultural Development branch that played a role in relationships between groups, intercultural understanding and multiculturalism and so on. But all of the provinces were very, very heavily involved in settlement at that time, and particularly the larger provinces like Ontario, Quebec, BC, Alberta, Manitoba, but all provinces were involved in both language training, which we had the responsibility for the delivery, and a lot of settlement. So for example, my branch funded youth organization and all of the multicultural centers, the ethnocultural centers, especially in Metro, that were doing settlement services, but they were funded through the Multicultural Development Branch for intercultural projects. And as well, we had a very large language training role in my ministry. We were responsible for all of the textbooks, all of the support system, teacher training, and so on for the whole province. And programs were delivered through community groups that we funded, school boards and colleges. And so often at the time, the model was a community group working in partnership with school boards, so that there were, for example, 200 parent and preschool programs around the province and so on. But particularly in the larger urban centers at that point, because that's where most of the immigration had been in the more recent years after the government got very involved in the late 60s. The other agency that we worked with besides Naomi's branch was the Department of the Secretary of State. And they were very heavily involved in all the same areas that we were. On the language training side, there were two very important agreements that dated back to the 50s and 60s with the Department of the Secretary of State. And they funded 50% of teaching costs, regardless of the delivery organization, that was funded through 3 different ministries in Ontario. And what was called textbooks, but that covered all of the teacher training materials, all the textbooks, a newspaper that we had called Newcomer News that actually went right across the country. So did our textbooks go right across the country in those days, and a whole, just many, many aspects of the program, the print parts of it, the province funded the rest. And so when refugees came, we also had 2 important direct services. One was a reception service at Toronto International Airport, and the other was the Ontario Welcome House, which had started when the Ugandan Asians came, but you know, it had expanded, and it played two roles. It did direct counseling with newcomers, but it also helped many of the community organizations do troubleshooting when they were caught in the bureaucracy in some way and trying to serve their clients. So it had sort of two roles.
So I mean, there's just
Yeah.
an indication, pretty extensive infrastructure before the Indo-Chinese refugee movement even came to Ontario.
Right. And so we had been involved, I was involved with the Hungarians. I was thinking yesterday, gee, my Uncle Bob was the head of the Ontario region of Red Cross when they came, and they were, at that point, government didn't, they acted on behalf of government. But I was involved with Czech refugees, Tibetan refugees, the Indo-Chinese, the Ugandan Asians, the Chileans, and then of course, massively with the Southeast Asians.
So we'll come back to that in a moment. Hey, Rosanna, what was the context like in Metro Toronto?
Well, can I just step back a moment and start with the Secretary of State, just to fill in a little bit more information. I started work in the federal government in 1972 with Secretary of State and Social Development in the Toronto District Office, which had a territory bigger than just the metropolitan Toronto area, but obviously the lion's share of activity was in Metro Toronto. And as Betty said, we were working with a variety of programs which the department had established for each program for a different reason, but all had an underlying theme, which was the development of active citizen participation, removing whatever barriers existed historically for individual groups to be able to fully participate. So those social development programs, some of them like multiculturalism, our group in the Toronto office interpreted that program as having a fundamental human rights base. We knew very clearly that aside from the language agreements that Betty's mentioned, the role of our funding mechanisms and the role of our social development activity on the ground with community agencies was not about delivering individual services, short-term settlement services, employment services, because that was a mandate with Canada Employment and Immigration, with provincial government. The key areas that we were involved in through a variety of the refugee movements early on was actually assisting the newly emerging organizations as they developed their structures. So for example, we established a Center for Spanish-Speaking People shortly, the community established it with our assistance, shortly after the arrival of the Chilean refugees because of a group of very activist women who were very interested in ensuring a settlement. Just as one example, but it was the nature of the work that we did was in partnership with the community and in partnership with our colleagues in the other governments in terms of funding arrangements and with the United Way and other non-government funders in order to ensure that the fabric of the community was able to deal with changes and with establishing new methods of integrating newcomers into the community, as well as dealing with issues like women's issues and other social change issues that we were actively involved in throughout the early 70s. Do I have time to say a word about, so I want to come to Metro Toronto, do you want me to do that?
I want you to do Metro Toronto.
Okay. So to give you a bit of a profile of Metropolitan Toronto, in 1951, there were 1.2 million residents in Metropolitan Toronto, 19% of whom were born outside the country. By 1976, there were 360,000 immigrants being received into the community. The population at 71 was 2.1 million, 37% born outside of Canada. Of that 360,000 immigrants, it was about 31% of all Canadian immigration. 83% of most immigrants remained in the Toronto region within the first 3 years of their arrival. And we took something like 41% of the secondary migration from other regions in Canada. So we had a huge population in Toronto, and I think the Ontario government's policy and philosophy in those days was immigration has been good for the province. Immigration was very good for Toronto. It built our population, it built creative classes, it built employment bases, it built a whole range of very positive outcomes. However, change in immigration descriptions that Mike gave us earlier in the week in terms of entry requirements changed the face of immigration, so that by 76, the 34% of immigrant flow was European, while Asians, West Indians, and Africans composed 59%. So what happened is that we had suddenly a change in the face of the newcomer population in Toronto. And I'm saying this because it hasn't been raised deliberately, sort of clearly in the conversations we've had here, except for the National Citizen Coalition. I want to add a little depth to that. From 74 to 77, Toronto experienced numerous racially motivated violent incidents. They were very unusual for the community. It was something that shocked the community over time. Some of the milder forms of graffiti and name-calling and discriminatory experiences that some people of color experienced in the community were common experience that people had had. There had been lots of discussion about it, lots of reports written, multicultural program federally supporting some of the work that was done on racial discrimination. But in 76, we had a spate of racially violent episodes on the Toronto subway system. And to the extent that bystanders weren't intervening to help individuals, this one Tanzanian refugee who had been suffered long-term injuries as a result of being tossed on the subway tracks by young white men. Another 61-year-old older gentleman who had severe injuries as a result of interfering in some name-calling episodes on a subway track. I've had to review all of this history actually in preparing for today, and I had forgotten some of these very explicitly really ugly episodes that had happened. But the most important thing that happened was that two of the worst episodes happened on New Year's Eve in 1976. And what happened was that New Year's Day or New Year's week in 1977, the American media picked this up and did a 20-minute episode on NBC about how Toronto the Good was a racial time bomb. And some of you who were from Toronto may remember that, but that was the shock trauma for the political leadership in Metro Toronto around our nice, safe community, which is part of our brand, and our quiet little community, which has received all these people from all over the world, has suddenly turned into America. Now, there's similarities to what's happening today, which I won't refer to, but obviously the interest of the American media tends to wake us up politically from time to time. So what did Metro Toronto do? Metro Toronto appointed a task force at its inaugural meeting at Metro Council in 1977 and appointed Walter Pittman, who was the president of Ryerson Polytechnical at that time, and also the former Ontario NDP deputy leader. And he had a one-man task force with some budget to hire researchers and so on, worked from January 1977 to November 1977 when he submitted his report, Now Is Not Too Late. It was called the Task Force on Human Relations. We weren't quite comfortable with using the term race at that point. And he made a very important observation in doing his work, and that was surrounding all of these racially motivated episodes and all of the issues that had to do with discrimination and racism and so on, was the underlying factor that immigrant settlement and immigrant integration was a significant component of the work that needed to be done. And he had a series of recommendations related to immigrant settlement. primary in his comments was the fact that the Metropolitan Toronto government had absolutely no jurisdiction in immigration or in immigrant settlement or delivering specialized immigrant services, which raised a series of issues that we'll discuss further on. When the report was submitted, some didn't like it, it didn't go far enough, others thought it was too much, there's lots of debate about how to execute it. Typically, the Metro government set up a political committee to study this Pittman report and concluded with the Metro government adopting a fairly good policy statement, a 4-point policy statement that was new in municipal government in terms of establishing a direction and a political leadership and a moral responsibility. And it noted that it had no staff focus within the organization to do anything with race relations. So they mounted a competition. I applied, I got the job, I was seconded into the position from the federal government, partly because I think Metro thought this problem would go away in a couple of years and they didn't really want to make any permanent commitments. So at February 1979, sort of at the cusp of when all of the activity was happening on the Indo-Chinese refugee front, I had just begun my work, had just put my foot in the door at the Metro government. My first reaction was to say to everybody, don't panic, let me just finish this sentence, don't panic, be calm, because as Naomi indicated later, I kept saying to people, we have done this before. We have very good infrastructure both at the government level and at the community level. This is not, it's bigger, but it's not a new thought. This is something that we know how to do. So let's just not create another panic response to this particular issue.
Thank you. Okay, so that was the past, or that was the context before the massive influx. So my question number 2 is, how did that mass arrival of refugees change what your organization did, or how it did it? What was the impact of this massive influx? Anecdotes are welcome. Ralph, do you want to start?
Okay. I think in Windsor, it started, if I remember the name correctly, Andre Pilon was sent down to Windsor to arrange a meeting with the mayor. And that meeting brought out another meeting, excuse me, with the service providers and the churches and other agencies in the community. This is when word came that we were going to be receiving a large number of Southeast Asians. And this group included the CEC that sent me over to the mayor's office for this meeting. And from then, it just seemed that things kind of...
Ralph, is there a techie in the room who can figure out why it froze? Ralph, can you hear us? We lost him. Okay, while we're calling him again, Deborah, do you want to pick up?
Certainly. He's offline at the moment. It may have just been his internet.
Can you call him? But could you try to resolve that, and we'll continue on. Deb?
Okay, once in London that we heard about the influx of Southeast Asian refugees, first of all, we were incredibly excited. Right away, another councillor was brought into the program unit, so there were then 2 of us, and it was great because with the other program areas, I had a lot of on-demand programs, so it was really hard to plan and even think about how you could do settlement when you had to be in the office every minute in case of other emergencies in other areas. So I had a colleague join me, and that was wonderful. I think that's a theme I'd like to emphasize, is it's really great to have more than one person in any kind of an effort, because all of a sudden you gain greater ideas and greater strength and ability to risk a little bit. I always told her because she was new, she would have to take the blame for everything we did wrong. We also started to talk to our partners. The ISAP agency in London was a cross-cultural learner center, and they had just recently been funded under the Immigrant Settlement and Adaptation Program. They were in the process of recruiting someone who spoke Vietnamese. We met with the city, and we developed together with the city a forum to bring together anyone who was interested in understanding what was happening. Of course, we had no idea, but we were sharing that lack of understanding with people, and we got engaged with a lot of the other levels of government, and just initial talks and getting to know people's needs, and you know, the beginning of relationships that were life-changing in our community. Internally, about a month after, 6 weeks after the refugees started to come from Vietnam, and we were receiving, as I recall, anywhere from 8 to 10 some days and 20 to 30 other days, but 2 or 3 times a week. And so it was pretty busy, and trying to really learn settlement work as we were going along. The position of refugee liaison officer was created, and Helene talked about her role in Kitchener with that position. In London, the Carrie Reid individual, who I think many of you probably know, was the person who was recruited to work with us under that program. And yeah, I feel very responsible for training him in the misadventures of his early years. Anyway, he came to join us, and as opposed to the situation in Kitchener, where the individual really took on a refugee liaison officer role, we had been very much involved in the community development aspect and community promotion aspect already. So we really didn't want to give that up, and Carrie really, really wanted to help with the hands-on work of working with refugees. So we threw away his job description, and we divided the tasks up, and we all did everything. It was quite wonderful, although he didn't do the other programs, so he had more concentration in the community, which we always told the manager not to worry.
But then we stole him.
Yes.
And took him to regional office
Yes.
because he was so wonderful.
That's right, yes. I'll never forgive you for that, yes. Yeah. So anyway, and then right after Carrie began with us, Carrie and I interviewed some newcomers for a position in the office for an interpreter and administrative assistant for our unit, and it was wonderful because we had no clerical assistants, and mathematically challenged, all of us were. So considering the budget we were managing and what we were getting into, we hired a young woman who came to Canada about 6 months earlier, sponsored by a church, Chan. Chan had arrived 8.5 months pregnant, gave birth to a baby boy with Down syndrome. She had a 3-year-old daughter. And she basically changed our lives and changed the organization. She began with us, and within probably 3 months she could have handled the whole organization. And although we got functional direction from Naomi's group, largely it was from Chan. She gave us the direct direction, and it was very clear. And a wonderful woman, and I can't even talk about the remarkable things she did. So that's how our unit changed. We began to have quite a close relationship with the regional office. Again, we were in the employment center. Immigration at regional office gave us functional direction, so that was an interesting relationship. I think Ralph is going to talk about some of his structural difficulties within the organization in Windsor. But I will say in London, we had such wonderful leadership and open-minded people in our office that we didn't face some of the struggles Ralph will probably talk to you about. We had really strong support, and the manager basically said, please don't tell me what you're doing, because it'll be better for me. You don't know half of it, so it's good.
Give us an example of something that one would never expect a CEC employment counselor civil servant to have done. And we won't
tell.
We won't.
Yeah. Well, I'll give you an example about our office. as soon as the refugees started to come from Southeast Asia, I mean, it was chaotic and busy. It was early on that we started to try and think about some strategic kinds of things to help. But also we were thinking about kind things from a personal level, because that's really kind of what makes the difference for people. We had a group of women in our office who started knitting and crocheting and quilting baby blankets. So in London, Ontario, if you came as a government-sponsored refugee with a baby 1 year or younger, at the airport, we took a blanket and wrapped your baby in it. And if your baby was born in Canada, that first year, you got a baby blanket. Another thing we did, which was
Other
kind of,
duties as not assigned.
we decided first Christmas, because kids had nothing, and they didn't have televisions, they didn't have toys, and I mean, we got some donated things. So we sent a note around, because we didn't even have email or anything, a note around to the office and said, would people be willing to step up and provide a Christmas gift for a refugee child? And everybody was so gung-ho. And I can say, I worked in Refugee Settlement for 25 years in that office. For 25 years, every Christmas, every child got a gift from our staff. And I'll let Ralph talk.
Ralph, are you
On
there
a
yet?
particular point, Debbie, I'm glad you brought that up. I wanted to clarify something about my comment about the office's initial response. The staff itself, that first year, I think we had probably 80 arrivals by Christmas. The clerical staff of the unemployment insurance side got together with the CEC clerical staff and organized a Christmas party. They had it in the boardroom, and as I recall, this is something that came up into my memory bank well after I talked to Naomi and wrote that little report. We had the NBC affiliate and the ABC affiliates from Detroit. They came to the office to film and to report on the news about this Christmas party. The following year, in 1979, the party was so big, they had to move it to the YMCA, one of our partners that had it in the gym there. And we had a party of that nature every year until about 1990, as far as I can recall. But Debbie's experience was pretty close to, my experience rather was pretty close to Debbie's, only I suppose not quite as emotional, because I know Debbie, and that was nice. I really enjoyed that, Deb.
Thanks, Ralph.
How did the massive arrival of refugees change?
Well,
your organization?
I was just talking about all the layoffs and questioning our lack of capacity in Sudbury. Within the next 5 years, we brought in, there was 500 Southeast Asians living in Sudbury 5 years later. Now, how did that come about? I think there was a kind of a perfect storm of a lot of elements coming together. Some of you've already talked about. It was just a different environment at that time. The people who helped fund this kind of frontline work, or they helped develop a Vietnamese association so that the community could stand on its own. I mean, the funders, including Citizenship and Immigration at the time, Secretary of State. I remember Bob Parks coming up to Sudbury, not dressed properly, wearing Toronto shoes. But we sat around having spring rolls and fish sauce, talking about how we're going to build a Vietnamese community in its own association so that people can be helping themselves. The funding environment was such that the great policies that came out of Secretary of State, they and Ontario Province, they talked about funding for new emerging groups. I mean, they talked about community development. They talked about developing strong boards. You could get funding to help a little association get on its feet. And the immigration folks, the province, the feds, their names, their titles were called Social Development Officer. That was MacDonald Blanc, a woman who helped mentor me in Northern Ontario about how to build strong, independent communities. Culture and Recreation at that time, they were called Community Development Officers. They were bureaucrats who gave a damn about what was going on in the community and worked hand in hand with us to build networks. It wasn't just us taking money out of our own pockets to buy something for our family. It was how to engage the city, how to engage the university, how to engage the college, the school boards, church groups. How can we all rally together to meet this challenge?
Betty?
Okay, well, when the IRS movement started, something happened in government that I hadn't seen before, and that was that it happened very, very quickly. I came back from a study year in May of '79. I was at OISE for a year doing my master's, and I came back, and in June, I was called to a meeting with the other managers, and we had marching orders from the top level of the province that we needed a plan on how to deal with the Indo-Chinese refugees within 2 weeks. And I never saw it actually happen. And I never saw something like that happen in government before. So in 2 weeks we had a plan. And for the first time with this particular refugee movement, because it was going to be so massive, and we knew that if it followed the pattern, 50% of the refugees would probably come to Ontario, both government-sponsored and privately sponsored. And I asked the minister after he spoke the other day if he had called his counterparts in Ontario, when he first found out about it, and he said, oh yes, immediately I called Tom Wells, Intergovernmental Affairs. And then he told me a little anecdote about how Tom Wells had warned him about something they were saying in Ottawa out of one side of their mouth, and that if they said what they were planning to say about the Indo-Chinese refugee settlement, they were going to have a big communication problem, so they changed their communication strategy after that. But he got a commitment from Tom Wells and from our minister that yes, we were going to be there to support this movement. And so for the first time, we were going to build on what we had already, which was in 3 units in my branch, but we were going to have a 2-year standalone unit, not standalone, but standalone only in terms of spearheading and keeping everyone doing what they needed to do in the other units to meet the demand. And so the IRS unit, the manager of reception services, which was the Toronto International Airport and the Welcome House, was seconded to head that unit for 2 years. And the person who had replaced me as supervisor in my unit was the next person seconded, and she was going to be responsible for the outreach across the province to bring all the partners together around whatever we would be involved in. And her name was Edna Rigby, and if she were she's away at the present time, but I think she probably would have been here instead of me if she had been here, but I'm standing in for her. So we hired additional staff at the reception services and the Welcome House, and Peter Tran was here yesterday. He was a counselor that was hired at that time at Welcome House. Like the federal level, within Ontario, a newsletter was started to keep all the partners in the province up to date and involved. There were new language training programs initiated and funded, and teachers trained. The school at the Welcome House was beefed up, but more importantly, as Edna went out to smaller communities around the province that didn't have services at that time because there hadn't been much recent immigration, and the sponsorship groups were forming in these new areas, she was trying to get programs going So again, bringing together school boards, colleges, community organizations, sponsorship groups, whoever, municipalities, to get the programs that were needed in the smaller communities. And she spent a lot of time, everybody here has talked about the extra time they put in, and I'd say that was right across the board at all levels of government and definitely in the community. But I know Edna, for example, she'd be in a smaller community, and she when I said to her what were the challenges, she said, well, just that everything had to be immediate, and she said things were happening, sponsorship groups were getting people, and they weren't oriented to the people that they were going to be meeting at, you know, the next day at the train, and she was doing, you know, she'd be there weekends and nights and so on. She'd be teacher training with new ESL people. She'd be orienting sponsorship groups just before the people came into the community. And I know I can vouch for the fact that she put in probably double time for that, pretty much most of that 2 years. And a lot of other people put in, including myself, put in a lot of extra time. We had a teacher's journal that went across the country at that time called Tessel Talk, and there were a number of articles over that, in that. It included information for English teachers on the 3 language groups and how that would interrelate with teaching English, on pronunciation and structure and so on. There was an article about a pilot orientation program in Toronto that was then built upon, learned from and built upon elsewhere. There were articles on mental health issues. There was one issue that came out early, it was a guest editor, Harold Troper, and there were articles in there that included what was just beginning to happen with the IRS movement. It was looking at a decade of immigration policy, that particular issue. And what resources were available in Canada, but also in the US. There was a Chinese English phrase book that was used by ethnic Chinese immigrants or refugees from Vietnam. A book in the Vietnamese community was published by the Multicultural Development Branch, and I talked to Harold, to Thad Rockwell about that, and he said he remembered they sent out probably 14,000 copies of this. He said it was quite substantial, over 100 pages, but all he could remember was that he thought Margaret Macmillan had written the first chapter on history. They also provided grants to community groups to assist with some of the issues related to integration and intercultural communication from that branch, the Multicultural Development Branch. And we also funded newer and emerging organizations in the smaller urban centers where refugees were going. Early in the 80s, we undertook a pilot called the Cultural Interpreter Program, and I've described some of these things a bit more in the handout that I prepared. It was, you know, this unit lasted for 2 years, but all of the activities were right across the branch, and we all worked very, very closely to make sure there were no silos in the branch or how we operated with other people outside of the branch. So that was a first in Ontario, whereas, you know, it was a massive movement, separate unit to just spearhead everything we were doing.
Rosanna?
Well, as I indicated earlier, we have no responsibility for any of these specific program activities, but my job, and just to point out, I was appointed as a solo operator with no budget and no staff, so I have a single point of reference in a very large government. Just another context point, Metropolitan Toronto was one of the regional governments in Ontario that was a 2-tier system. So important to realize that some of the services like health, library, recreation, were delivered at the lower tier, at the local government level, and policing, transit, social services from the point of view of welfare, childcare, hostels, were delivered at the metropolitan level, and it was Metropolitan Toronto that held most of the cost-sharing arrangements with the provincial government. So our big issue as a government was not the short-term reception and settlement of immigrants, but the long-term impact on the metropolitan territory. And because there were health issues raised, because there were big concerns about where were we going to house these people, did we have enough entry-level housing for that number of newcomers. There were coordination efforts undertaken by staff at the former City of Toronto, and hostels, I think, were engaged very early on in programs that continued over the years and continue still today in terms of the accommodation of the early accommodation for refugee arrivals. So our big challenge was public health, housing was really a provincial responsibility with some activity at the metro level and some activity at the City of Toronto level. Hepatitis B issues were huge issues for the medical officers of health, and there were 6 of them. So we're not just talking coordinating 2 governments at the local level with the province and the fed. We're talking about 6 lower tier governments talking about public health, and a metropolitan government which really didn't coordinate the activities in public health. So that was an issue that came to be known as a human services coordination issue at the metropolitan level that we dealt with over the years, and talk about that later. But my activity was in this little whirlwind of people raising questions about, well, don't we need to set up coordinating committees, and don't we need to set up a committee to do that? And my job was really trying to stop people from setting up more coordination mechanisms than were required in areas where we had no jurisdiction and couldn't make things happen. So we used the Settlement Program and Planning Committee mechanism to engage Metro Toronto in terms of my office and in terms of our social services division and its funding capacity with the United Way, included City of Toronto representation because they had the bulk of the interest, and tried to make some sense of our intergovernmental shared space and where we needed to have the collaborative and ongoing cooperation carried through during this period of time. What we struck was, under the Settlement Planning and Program Committee, we struck a little research committee, we struck the Southeast Asian Refugee Task Force, which ultimately wrote a rather large report on the experience with the Southeast Asian refugees. The report was published in '81, I think.
Yes.
So a lot of, I wound up with a lot of the busy work of going to meetings and talking to people and making sure information was shared and so on. What I brought to the table, which was new in the municipal government at that point, was a good understanding of the short-term and long-term settlement infrastructure in the community. I had relationships with the key staff, some of whom are here, in the various government departments that were engaged in these areas. I had relationships with funded agencies that went back to my earlier days as Secretary of State. So what was a challenge for me was that the political structure and nature of municipal politics was my steep learning curve, because the politicians at municipal level tend to engage at a more hands-on level than they do at the federal and provincial level. So the separation between staff and politicians is slimmer in the municipal sector than it is in the federal and provincial government. So I wasn't as skilled in that particular activity as in the early days. You learn it fairly quickly. But the main issue for me was, given my job was to implement the recommendations of the Pittman Report. That's what I was there to do. I had a 2-year timeline at that point to do it. So I saw the Indo-Chinese refugee movement and the intergovernmental activity, the coordination, the funding, and so on, as an opportunity to leverage action on the recommendations that Pittman had made relative to long-term change in how municipal government participated in immigration and refugee issues. The biggest concern, both at Metro and at the City of Toronto, was the lack of prior consultation on these movements of people, especially when they were so big and so fast, so that the machinery of at the local level of government could in fact activate with the full, or at least the similar level of information that the federal and provincial governments were dealing with in terms of what was going to happen. So that was a source of irritation then, and it tended to be a source of irritation for several years thereafter. The backlash issue continued a wee bit because of some panic over whether or not we were going to be able to absorb the numbers that were coming to Toronto. I found myself on the Morley Shulman show on City Pulse, the Moses neighbor's activities there while he was doing the positive things, also a kind of a talk show host who liked to agitate. So I found myself with my colleague Nathan Gilbert from the City of Toronto trying not to exacerbate the situation on that show. It was I wasn't expecting to be doing that in terms of things I didn't want to do. I didn't want to make it about me and about the function of the city. So a lot of the prior consultation, just to ease into lessons learned a little bit, a lot of the prior consultation with municipal level from federal and provincial governments, which happened a little more easily in smaller communities than it did in the big old metropolitan Toronto region, which was more complex, helps to deal with the fact that it's the Canadian media is centered in Toronto. So you need to be really cautious and careful about how you set the moral leadership and the trend lines in terms of news coverage and conversations, and you can't do that if you're not talking to each other.
Okay. We're not going to do question number 3 and question number 4 as we plan, because we're running out of time and I want there to be time for questions. What I would like the panelists to do now, though, is sort of a combination. And talk now, if you could, about, given today's context, and there have been enormous changes from then to now in a whole variety of areas. I mean, a lot of what Betty described no longer exists in the province of Ontario, period. It's just not done, it doesn't exist. They were cut back under the Harris government in Ontario, and they're not there anymore. Some of the roles played by the CEC are not played by the CEC anymore. Everything has been devolved to third-party delivery agents. CEC people don't do that role. So given what has changed, given what we learned from those exercises, Tella, and given today's context, tell us what you think can be applied to either current or new refugee movements. What did you learn that you think could apply today and tomorrow for new refugee movements in terms of the organizational roles? Ralph, do you want to start?
I think I should leave that to those on the panel that have been involved recently. Remembering it's been 20 years for me since I've been away from this. I know I don't look that old, but so I think I'd like to leave that to the, and especially the CEC part. I think that my good friend Debbie can probably handle that much better than I can.
Okay, well, feel free to jump in when you have something that occurs to you a little bit later on, perhaps, okay?
Okay, fine.
Deb.
Okay, I'm trying to figure out how I can put into this answer 2 or 3 things I really want to say. Anyway, but to answer your question, some of the things that we learned that were really important was the power of the media, and at a local level in London, we had incredibly supportive coverage from the local newspaper and television stations, and they did interviews with individuals, and they, with the approval of the people coming who had no idea what we were talking about when we asked for their approval, they filmed some of the arrivals and did some follow-up stories, so it was really incredible. I remember early on, it was probably maybe September or even August of the movement in '79. I was logging volunteer calls, and we had some big coverage the night before. So that morning we were pretty busy, and that day I logged over 100 volunteer calls.
Meaning people who wanted to volunteer.
People calling and saying, I read the story, I want to help, what can I do? We didn't have call waiting, so that was a blessing because they had to keep calling back until they could get somebody to answer. But I finally recruited somebody to answer the phone and write down, brief messages and to say we would get back to people, understanding that it would be such a disaster to lose that momentum and that incredible willingness to help and energy. But we really did not have the capacity even to answer the calls, let alone to organize any kind of a response. We had been very involved with most of the churches in the city by then, but just down the street from our office was Metropolitan United Church. And there were, I think, 3 or 4 women there who were, had become friends and were very, very much involved. They came in and said, what can we do? And we said, can you sit on the phones and call people and start to, and we made a list of what the different possible volunteer roles would be. And we had maybe half an hour to do this planning. And then they said, we're going to set up an action center in the church basement. All the calls can be forwarded to us. We'll advertise in the paper, and we'll start, organizing. So until we had our feet on the ground, and the Cross Cultural Learning Center was more well-staffed, and we got our act together, and we're working in good unison. And we really understood the role of the volunteer. They handled gathering goods that people were delivering, arranging for people to offer transportation, offering people who wanted just to tutor people who were waiting for language classes. It was a marvelous thing, and it actually became the forerunner in our eyes for the host program. And very early on, we decided that even for this group, how are we going to screen people? Like, we don't want people who have bad intentions to be involved. How are we going to train them and support them? How are we going to recognize their good work? So we developed probably a 10-page paper on what that might look like. I remember sending a copy to Naomi. A couple of years later, it was a funded program, the host program. I think the same thing was happening pretty well in every town, city across Canada, trying to find some way to bring people together. But I guess that would be one huge learning, is to understand that, first of all, they're hopefully with all the stars being aligned, there will be wonderful response from the public. But you have to be able to take that energy and respond to it and get people involved. And it was a wonderfully successful program. Another thing we started to realize, we were housing people when they first arrived in a reception, or in a old hotel downtown. It's a family-run hotel. It was wonderful. I think they had 18 rooms. So we had to quickly move people because we had more people coming. And when they talk about polygamy, we encouraged some polygamy because we didn't have enough rooms at the end. We started to see what would be the potential for a reception center, and work with the ISAP agency in terms of starting to formulate how that might look and what would be the benefits of that kind of thing. We had a wonderful relationship with the schools and the colleges, because English was an enormous issue, and we were the ones who provided the documentation to get people into schools. We realized for the Board of Education, to respond to the children, we had to really have clear communication with them about what was happening and try and deal with any concerns they had about health. How would we support the schools when there were problems, maybe family issues, or a child who had maybe special needs of some sort? So all of those kinds of networks, and really, although we had talked, delving down and trying to find a systematic way that could quickly and efficiently bring together the people at the right time in the right place to address the needs. and be endlessly creative. So I guess, I don't know if I answered, but just a few points.
Thank you.
Excuse me, I had one idea that while Debbie was talking, I hope that now there's a little bit more flexibility in the settlement process itself. I had people settle at a different rate. Some of the newcomers we got, especially in that first group from Southeast Asia, preferred to get here, get a place to live, get the family established in school, those that needed to go to school, get a job, then maybe improve their English. Our program was so structured, you had your 6 months English in the beginning, hopefully to take some of the weight off the financial part of the AP, and then you move on to the rest of the settlement process, the job planning. If it was more flexible, I think people might settle a little quicker and it would be easier on the family itself.
You.
Just reflecting back, the thing that comes up very clear in my mind is the concept of leadership, but not leadership in a military sense or in a top-down sense, but a leadership that's very affirmative, that encourages other leadership, that makes youth stand up and say, I want to be a leader, or I want to be involved. It speaks to the leadership in all of us. I saw that in Dorothy Sturtridge, who was with Sudbury Save the Boat people. Very life-affirming. And one of the first things she did was bring a few Vietnamese colleagues to the local golf course where her husband was a mentor, and heads were being turned. I mean, she was there for making change, and she wanted to do it in every aspect of her life. People like Marion Dewar. I mean, when you work with Marion Dewar, it inspires you to lead. I mean, you're not just following someone. People like Mike, who's so life-affirming in all the things that he does in a very tough department back in those days. Eleanor Ryan, who's Marion Dewar's sister, who chaired Project 4000. By the way, this is a good book. Gift of Freedom, Brian Buckley. Everyone will relate to this. It talks about Project 4000. Anyways, I had to give that pitch. And I think, let me just read a quote. It's a quote about leadership by Rabbi Plout that he was making a speech, and it's burned indelibly in my mind. He said, leadership must lead us with the very best of human instincts: love, generosity, respect for each other as human beings, not lead us by our baser instincts: fear, hatred, avarice, opportunism. For in the end, we will be judged not by the way we relate to those in power, but by how we treat the world's most vulnerable and disenfranchised. So that kind of captures my important learning from leadership.
Thank you. Betty, lessons learned.
Okay. Well, I just need to backtrack a little bit, because I just have to say that the infrastructure that existed then and was in its heyday in Ontario did not just disappear under Harris. It was a slow drip, starting with the Liberals. The first thing that happened that affected all of the provinces massively was the one-day notice after the Eric Nielsen report in, I think, '86, that the language training agreements were gone. 1 day's notice, language training agreements that have existed for 20 years and I think 15 years, gone. Some of the provinces started cutting back right away. Ontario had, at that point, a new liberal government, and they didn't start cutting because we weren't in recession at that point in '86. But they did cut the reception service at the airport. The NDP came in 1990, and in '91 the recession hit big time in Ontario, and they started cutting back, and basically all of the support system was gone, all the textbooks, the language training. There was no federal incentive anymore for those, and the money wasn't there, and everything was cut other than Newcomer News. That wasn't, what they didn't cut though were the 2 grant programs that funded the community groups, the Newcomer Language and Orientation classes and the Newcomer Integration. So those were still there. What was cut under Harris was the NLOC program, so, you know, 200 parent and preschool programs down the drain, numerous language programs gone, and then the Newcomer News, which was the last thing still coming out of the ministry. So I used to say to people, well, really, all they did is put it out of its misery at that point, because there was just nothing left. 2 things that were done that I didn't mention earlier, but I underscore one of the points you're making. There were the short-term, the expansion across the province of services in smaller communities was really important, and one other thing was the intercultural understanding, again in smaller communities, perhaps more than larger, that came out of those sponsorship groups working directly with families and saying that, you know, we're all people, as someone said yesterday, I think you said yesterday, we're all people, and that working with people very, very directly, I think, takes away the kind of fear that you have and builds tolerance. So those were short-term, but also longer-term maybe outcomes. So the important things, one of the things I didn't mention 2 things. We did the Newcomer's Guide to Services in Ontario in collaboration with the 3 communities, the Vietnamese, the Lao, and the Cambodian, and they were much more detailed than anything available now, and integrating things around themes, orientation information around themes, and including all levels of government and the community. And they worked with us on those, and many thousands were distributed as the refugees came in. And the other thing is the 3 organizations, the ministry helped to form the 3 organizations, Vietnamese, Lao, and Cambodian, and they were given free space in the Welcome House where they could work with the counselors there and with each other, and they were also given funding for staff. So for example, John Chu was hired by the Vietnamese Association, and he was on the In Memoriam the other day, and the presidents of the Lao and Vietnamese associations, Tom Vu and Boon Cha, and I don't know the last name of the Lao, but both of those young men died of cancer in their 20s, and if anyone worked overtime, they did. They had to keep going in their regular, one was a student, the Lao man was only 21 when he got involved, and Tom was a little older with a wife and 2 kids, and they worked every night and every weekend for years on end. And I think they both probably killed themselves over what they did for their communities in that period. So the involvement of the actual communities that are going to be, you know, coming in as refugees is so important. And someone was talking about the Syrians, and I was thinking then, from day one, you have to involve the progressive Muslim organizations and Muslim individuals, and also the Arabic-speaking organizations and so on, if there were to be something. Community development approach, which Rosanna mentioned at Sex State and you mentioned, that was very much our approach in the province to what we were doing in the 2 branches that were involved. The partnership of all levels of government with the NGOs and also with the educational institutions like the school boards and colleges. Good communication, and then you mentioned yesterday, I think, trust amongst all the parties, and that's what often I think we feel is missing now between the current government agencies that administer, yeah, there isn't the level of trust that we used to have amongst ourselves and amongst between government and at all levels and the groups. Some decrease. We did not have the level of bureaucratic process that exists now. Yes, there were forms to fill out at every level of government. Yes, there were audited statements needed. Yes, there were, reports and so on. But the level of bureaucracy in delivering services like LINK and probably the other programs now is massive. Someone said I think the forms for refugees are like 24 pages long or something for sponsorship. So, and part of what goes with that is that at that time at all levels of government, the frontline staff actually came out of the field. So we would be hiring the people out of the field, out of the community that had the experience. And the monitoring that we did was not just paper monitoring by bureaucrats who didn't have a clue about how to run a program in the field. It was partly done by the communication and the visits and so on by the frontline staff in government. And you didn't need the level of paper, which, anyone can fill out paper and say whatever they want, but if you don't have someone going out and seeing what's on the ground and communicating with people, that's the real monitoring, and that's probably what I think is missing in many, many cases now.
I think that's great.
Okay.
Anything really critical, or could we go on to the last?
Well, one thing that's really critical to me in Ontario anyway is we've, LINK programs have been cut 30%, 12%, so most of the childcare is gone now. That was something we had with programs, childcare, that doesn't exist now. So I think that, that's some of it.
Thanks. Roseanne, I'll ask her to you.
Okay, I'll try to be concise. To repeat, early consultation amongst the governments is critical. And we need, and this is a theme that's emerging all through the few days here, the trust and collaboration and respect amongst the governments, the NGOs, civil society, the private sector. Those are elements that allow us to bring each jurisdiction to the table, to work within the competencies of that jurisdiction with respect, and to respect those jurisdictions and respect the specific competencies that are brought to that table, so that you know that what you need to receive from the community you're trying to serve is as legitimate as the concern of the jurisdiction that is delivering the service. That's the true partnership. That's the sectors. That's magic if it happens. It's wonderful and it's joyful. I think the other key learning that we keep learning every year is that there is a difference between the short and the long-term activity that goes on relative to any particular movement, whether it be a refugee movement or any other social change movement. And that is that, the front end of a movement has a lot of passion and energy and adrenaline that kicks in. And if you have the right doses of leadership at the community and the political level and inside the bureaucracies, you get a lot done, as we've heard, and you get a lot done in timetables that are unheard of. It's unsustainable over the long term. And the reality is that over the long term is where the impacts are most felt with how we have handled the long-term settlement and integration of refugees, whether it be through impacts on their education in the school system, language training, jobs, professional accreditations. All of those things require the highest level of collaboration and cooperation amongst people. And it needs to be sustained on an ongoing basis. And that's been the hardest part for organizations like Operation Lifeline and others. You cannot sustain that level of activity over the long haul. So you have to look at what other, I think the question for this group is what is it useful to do, or what actions can we take that energize people over the long haul? And which, you know, and are we replacing, I mean, we're, you know, a gray-haired group here in large measure, lots of young faces, but, you know, the passing on of the torch and the experience is really critical. I can say from the municipal level, we have come a very long way. What I outlined at the beginning, which was the state of affairs when I entered an office full of suits and a chief administrative officer, and I'm told with sandals and an Indian skirt, but I don't remember that because it was February, so I couldn't possibly have done that. But the reality is that I was a fish out of water in that environment institutionally, which didn't understand much about what it took to represent the community that was changing and that it served. Today I can say the amalgamated city of Toronto has given us a lot of benefits in terms of being able to coordinate services at a level that we're unheard of, that was unheard of in 1979. And the other really good news, and I'm very positive about, and I'm thrilled to death we were able to do this and to be able to leave that legacy behind, is that we trained staff, we educated them in simulations and so on. We gave managers responsibility for making sure that they reflected the statements of diversity and tolerance and equity that the organization had adopted. We tried to put action in policy behind those words, so that if you look at our community services activities now and grants, in the way we deliver services, in understanding the diversity of the community that we serve in Toronto, the infrastructure is even more robust today than it was in the 70s, notwithstanding that the feds and the province have vacated certain areas of funding and certain areas of policy development. So I'm fairly hopeful that if we can continue to consult and talk about how to settle large groups of refugees in urban, large and small communities, that we will be able to apply a whole new set of ethics and processes that we've developed over the years of hard learning that we've had several decades out now.
Thank you. I think that you see that we could have gone on much, much longer, but we're not. And I thank all the panelists. We do have a little bit of time for some questions.
Yes, and I know we all would like to have a break really soon, but I know that I would be remiss if I didn't add to one of the things that developed in Alberta between the federal government and the provincial government, and I'm actually not sure if it developed just at this time or a little bit predated it, but the agencies in other provinces were funded through ISAP. In Alberta, they were funded through ISP, which was Integrated Service Programming, and the federal government and provincial governments worked together. They had their discussion together around what would be the amount of funding, and we, as a settlement agency, only had one proposal to write that went and was read by both of them and then funded. And that was a really, it kind of continues until today, except that there's been changes with the federal government, so it's not quite the same as it has been. But that I know that when we talk with our colleagues across the country, we are always very grateful for that. So I just wanted to be sure that that was on record. I also, the comment that was made about the importance of involving the ethnic groups and associations, which of course as settlement agencies, that's where we are and that's what we do. With, of course, one has to have the awareness that the groups who arrive are never one group or united. And there will be the different ones, and balancing that and knowing how you're going to work with them, that's a real challenge. But I also, then I have one question to ask now. And that is whether any of you are aware of guess it's not that new, but the federal initiative that is called, the acronym is LIPS, L-I-P-S. And I'm sorry, but local something.
Immigration partnerships.
Yes, okay. It feels like now the federal government is saying, doing what you've already described was happening back then. And I know that when they came out to talk with us in Edmonton about that, it was sort of like, well, we've been doing that. But I just wondered what your comment, because actually since that time that you're talking about, there really was the development of silos. And so there really is a need, particularly on behalf of government, to get back to, you know, better communication among all the different branches, departments, and so on, which has been a challenge, you know, when you are a settlement agency. But I just wondered if any of you had comment about that.
I think I had retired by the time it was implemented, but Toronto and the federal government jointly took quite a large undertaking to implement local immigration partnerships across the broad city areas, so that we worked through community-based organizations around the broader metropolitan area, the entire city of Toronto, targeting the key neighborhoods that didn't have as sophisticated mechanisms. So they have executed that. And on your point, it meant building on infrastructure, and that's one of the things I'm very proud of, is because it's been integrated in our community services area. Instead of having somebody in a multicultural role dealing with the social service delivery mechanism, we've actually got what we used to think was really important was understanding that long-term immigrant settlement and community-based immigrant settlement in various neighborhoods is actually part of the entire human service policy field, and that it's important to integrate that. So thanks to the federal government, they gave us quite a bit of money actually to develop those partnerships, but we didn't develop them, the community did. And the community executed, and we facilitated that and used the research that they developed, and I think they've published a report on it. I may have missed the final chapter on that, so it's a very legitimate initiative and a good point.
Mike?
Yes, I had the real privilege of sitting sort of at the contact point between everything that was going on overseas and dimly perceiving what I thought was everything going on at the local level. And it's mind-boggling to think of how complex and varied what it took to operate in those camps, coordinate in Geneva, coordinate in each of those countries, make sure everything was going, people going off to 80 different countries, with IOM and UNHCR doing all the things, volunteers mixed up in all those, local camp committees, turning squalid camps into real cities, all that sort of stuff. Then it comes to it hits us, and then it breaks out, and the refugees are serendipitously sent hither and thither all over the place, and you guys catch them. And I've just been thinking that if I've said this to Susan and James and Michelle, there is a doctorate in taking this panel and Shauna's panel and debriefing them. There's a doctorate. When you think of just the levels of ingenuity, leadership, all those things that came together, it's the Canadian genius at its best, I think. And I don't think anything like this happened in most other countries. And I'm totally blown away by what I've heard today. So I think as we think beyond this thing, and we want to influence policy, getting these stories into a document, into something, a vehicle that can be absorbed by students, by junior bureaucrats, by politicians and others, can have a huge impact, because it's not just inspiring, it's how you do it, it's the can-do that makes it really exciting, and I'm very much on that. Just one comment on the problems in that that, of racial discrimination. My dad was born in Toronto, although I'm a British Columbian. And when he learned to read, the first things he used to read walking home in the beaches were signs in the windows of shops saying, help needed, no Irish. Help needed, Catholics need not apply. You know, generation to generation, wave after wave, we have to deal with this garbage. I just think we got better at it with the passage of time. Third thing, Deb and Ralph, somebody's going to come after you about the Kurds, okay? We've been trying to track down in the Historical Society what happened to those people, because I remember the lunacy of bringing those people in and our great brilliance in saying, oh, there's some Arab families out there somewhere, let's put the Kurds with the Arab families, it'll be nice. That's like saying, let's take these refugees from Dublin and put them with these nice families from Belfast. You know, but the Historical Society will be in touch with you about that, because that's a little group, but it's really kind of important in the general learning cube. Third thing, documentation. This project is going to go in the direction of building the world's greatest collection of artifacts, information, documentation on the Indo-Chinese refugee movements. It's got to be done. I hear when you talk about the newsletters and whatnot that were being sent out in Ontario, we covet them. If you okay, if there are copies, if anybody's got it, that sort of thing is extremely valuable. And so if anybody can has some squirreled away in a basement or something, please let us know. Well, I guess that's all I'm just. I don't have a question about this, but just to say, this is what it was about. This is the essence that we're hearing today of why we were able to take those strangers and so efficiently, with all the crap that happened along the way, so efficiently absorb them into our society. It's what you guys did and what people like you throughout the system did. So that's all.
Thank you, Mike. It's sort of like when I worked in government and ministers were really, really excited about the legislative process. And once a piece of legislation was passed, they thought it was done. Implementation was something they weren't terribly interested in unless it flew up in their faces. But, you know, getting the policy approved, getting the legislation done, I sort of often felt that way. You know, we did everything overseas, we brought the refugees here, and then it would just happen. They would just take care of themselves. It wasn't quite that. I mean, I know that this panel took a lot of time, but just to give you a sense of how, who some of the heroes and heroines are with Ralph and Deb and others across the piece who really did this kind of work, needs to be acknowledged.
Oh, I know it's a bit late, but I kind of wanted to raise these couple of issue questions. First, second, 100% what Mike said. I think our CIHS needs anything you guys have. I mean, it's just enormous value. With respect to the future, the comments that were made on the future, I think what came through very much, I think, especially from Betty's comments, how very much bureaucratization and depersonalization at all levels and lack of communication of governmental agencies has changed the playing field. And my question is, do you think, I've kind of witnessed that, and do you think that that type of tendency can at least be slightly overturned? Because in my opinion, unless it is, it would be very difficult to do the type of activity that you have described back in the 70s and early 80s. And comments on that. And secondly, a comment on what Rosanna was saying about the short and long term. Well, I'm a refugee actually, I'm a Hungarian refugee. And when we arrived back in 1957, for us, and I can sign a statement to that, what was important was the short term, i.e., by the time we were in the country, and that includes young and middle-aged people too, not the old ones, not that I was a child, but you know, we, after 6, 7, 8, 9 months, we were fine. We worked, we were in the schools. I never had an English as a second language course in my life, but I was the best student in my class in 2 years. So, hey, you know, like we didn't really seem to need that. And I just want you comments, whether the later movements or other movements need that more, the longer term, and if so, why?
If I could just jump in, I don't think, and correct me if I'm wrong, Rosanna, when Rosanna was talking about short-term, long-term, she wasn't talking so much about the short-term or long-term needs of the refugees. She was talking about the kind of collaboration, the kind of consultation, the kind of coordination among all the various players can't be sustained at the intensity that it was if everything is only considered to be short-term. That those kinds of vehicles, those kinds of structures for ongoing collaboration, communication, have to be long-term, well-established, vehicles and infrastructure.
That brings us back to the first part of my question, bureaucratization, depersonalization, or how do you turn it around?
No, sorry if I can add, Naomi's absolutely correct. My point also is bringing about the institutional change.
Yes.
And the institutional sustainability of the relationships and the capacity to have social inclusion and harmonious community relations is at the underpinning of different immigration patterns that we have experienced, certainly in Toronto, over the years. Different groups, different needs in terms of speed of integration into the community at large.
Your question about, I get you to say it again, but simplifying the processes. I think part of it, in relating to what Naomi was saying about the politicians' interest and so on. But I mean, one of the things that goes along with, maybe simplifying processes and trusting in frontline staff to monitor things and to know when things are going well or not well in an individual program. Going blank here. Risk taking, because I have an anecdote about Naomi when I sat on that committee that Sex stayed in the city and so on. We all went and we talked about the grant applications, and it would have been better if we'd had the idea you had in Alberta, but they were sort of a broader spectrum of applications, not just settlement, the sort of broader context, but we talked about all our grants and so on. But I came into the meeting once and I was a little bit early, and I heard Naomi on the phone in her office just bellowing at some senior bureaucrat in Ottawa that had just done something that, really, really upset her. And I think it was a cut in funding or a change to some application that had been pre-approved through this process and so on. So, I mean, you have to have sort of guts, I think, to be successful in government. You have to be able to take risks. And it's very difficult now, I think, for bureaucrats to take risks because they don't often have the experience in the field to know when to take, and they have to understand government processes really well and how to take risks too. But I think that's something that I find when I talk to younger people, it's really, really difficult, and yet they would have the same creativity and innovation and ideas and spark that we had when we all started, but they just are in these little boxes where it can't happen. right now. At least that's my perception.
I'll just make a one or two sentences. We talked about in the 70s and 80s at the CEC, simple example myself, we met the airplanes, we helped buy the clothing, we went when babies were born at the hospital. We saw what was happening, we registered people in school, we were in families' homes every day. So we had that personal touch, and we were government. So I think often, my many friends who came during various refugee movements and are still my friends, they say that government being there was really important to them. And government being human, because a lot of them came from such a repressive situation. And so I left settlement work, broke my heart in 1998, because basically all of the good work of settlement was contracted out to agencies. So third-party contracting. Not that those agencies don't do as good a job as I ever could do, but from a personal standpoint, I look back and I wonder, did government lose a voice that was closer to the action? Because now it's a third party and then that third party, and it goes on, and so the distance from actually a government employee holding a baby is a long ways now.
I think that's a really important point in terms of how policy is made too. The people who make the policies are so distant from the actual frontline involvement, and there isn't the feedback loop there used to be. You know, Deb would call me and say, this is a trend that you have to know about, and I wouldn't know about it unless Deb had gone to those homes and seen what the problems were or what the issues were. And I could then take that to Mike Malloy and say, we have a problem that needs some kind of policy fix. It's not something that I can just wave a magic wand, although I tried to wave many magic wands, but there were some things that needed to get back up to headquarters. Without that direct feedback loop, there are some difficulties. And the accountability relationship now between government and the agencies are doing wonderful work. But the accountability is just more and more and more paperwork. There isn't, the content feedback of what are the problems, what are you seeing, how can we help? And really, how can we help? Not, we're from the government, we want to help, but those kinds of that relationship between the delivery bodies and government is not necessarily a positive one. So we're not hearing from those agencies what's really happening, and therefore we're not getting that feedback that we need.
Naomi, I just wanted to add that the Southeast Asian refugee movement, in response to it around small town Ontario, was a significant part of building the network of immigrant services organizations, OCASI, in Ontario. I sat on the board in its early years, during the early 80s, and you could tell, Toronto groups, Center for Spanish-Speaking Peoples, Jewish services, they were well established, but the rest of us were talking about Southeast Asian refugees, the Windsor, Thunder Bay, Ottawa. We were talking about what we were doing with our families there. So there was a lot of community organizing around it, and that had lasting effects.
Yeah.
The feedback loop helped to develop funding things like funds to help new and emerging groups. That came about largely because of the Southeast Asian movement and a response to it. So there was a lot of things that were sustained. The growth of OCASI as a advocacy and a community-based umbrella was in, could especially in small town Ontario, had a lot to do with this movement.
I'm going to have to cut it off there. We've gone well over our time, but thank you to our panelists. Thank you, Ralph, for being here with us on the screen. And
Very sorry
Good to see you,
I've
Ralph.
been there in person now.
okay, thank you.